These were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said. And then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Those three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they're ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way. So Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش الجندي العربي،
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية، أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية، أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين يصلح ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا،
واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده انتاجي وصنع ايديا.
واسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده انتاجي وصنع ايديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
واسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
пустяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
Продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ни весной снегопад, ни реке ни вода. Знамя юности планеты на всемирный твой отряд. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is 22:41 on the evening of the 26th of January 2024, and I'm coming to you live from a still rather chilly northwest of England, South Manchester to be precise. And if you have noticed above me in the top, my top right-hand corner of the screen, you will see a slightly new or updated piece of show artwork, and that is, of course, a picture from the Cultural Revolution era in China of the true five giants of the 20th century revolutionary processes, and that is, of course, not only Marx and Engels, of course, the founders of the tradition, but of course Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. And I thought I'd update the artwork to reflect the fact that, of course, the political outlook of this program, of this whole project that we're engaged in here, is as much balanced upon the theories of all five of those men as it is just on the previous three. So when we started off, I just called it Marx Engels Lenin Institute because it was a name that was basically available. I'm told that there was some sort of dodgy American who had it for a while, but he seems to have disappeared. But in truth, it should be called Marx Engels Lenin Stalin Mao, because those are the key influences. You could, of course, also throw in Kim Il-sung, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and others, but the five lads up there will do just fine, I think. And it's a marvelous piece of artwork. So let me know if you like it. The response in the chat so far seems to be favorable. And so we will begin by just outlining our agenda for this evening. Now, a couple of big ticket items, shall we say. We've first got the International Court of Justice case against the State of Israel, or, you know, the temporary occupation of Palestine, you could call it. And I'm going to be looking at that, and we're going to be needing to ask the question about, well, what does bourgeois law mean for revolutionaries, for communists? And we're going to be coming to that, so I'm not going to spoil that in advance. And then going to be looking at the questions related to that. And this is a piece that somebody on, I think it was Jeff on Telegram, don't know if he's in the chat tonight, asked me to respond to, and it's a piece of Yasha Levine's Substack regarding the Israel lobby. Now, if you haven't seen this, I will put this in the chat, but I was asked to respond to it, and I've taken a look through it, and I think it brings up some points which merit examination. So I'm going to take a look at that. And then the other thing, which is, of course, hitting the headlines and drawing hysteria as far away from the incident as you can get, which is, of course, southern Manchester. There are various libs getting hysterical about the Texas border in Manchester. Wouldn't afford it, but there you go. But we're going to be looking at that and what exactly is going on. Is this Civil War II, the sequel, with Greg Abbott in the role of Jefferson Davis? Or is this merely, is it an escalation of previously existing trends in American bourgeois politics? Is it a reflection of a deeper crisis of American imperialism? All of the above. So we're going to be, that's our three things. There will, of course, be questions coming in from yourselves in the chat, so always feel free to jump in with something. Always happy to respond. And before we go any further, I'm just going to drop the relevant links to this stream into Telegram and onto Twitter. As I said in the chat, be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't already. Always good for the numbers. Now, while I'm doing this, I will just mention, of course, that tomorrow at 2 p.m. we have a patron stream. I'm going to be doing 2 of these a month, hopefully going forward. And this is going to be dedicated purely to one question. And that question is going to be, of course, the question of sovereignty. It's the different conceptions of sovereignty. So, for instance, there's a big debate raging at the moment particularly in what you might call the sort of multipolarist circles, in some of those people who are commentators on the internet, some of the academics who are also favor the move to the what is referred to as the multipolar system. And the point I am going to be making, exploring, shall we say, tomorrow, is the idea that sovereignty, of course, the arguments around sovereignty are not some kind of equal playing field. So, as with anything else, you can't abstract sovereignty from the system of relations of production, which is what a lot of people are doing with relation to countries like France and Germany. There's an argument going around that these countries have completely surrendered their sovereignty to the US imperialists, and that they have become vassal states, basically, lacking any independent capacity for action. And this, I'm going to be arguing, is an understandable but a flawed conclusion. And I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow on the Patreon stream from 2 until we finish. So that's tomorrow 2 till probably about 4 p.m. So let's first of all start off then by greeting those who are in the chat. Daniel Kennedy says, gonna be a banger. The movement of the heartland of America against the coastal elites is something to see. Of course, without strong proletarian anti-establishment interests, it won't be good. Well, yes, you raise a good point. Things are developing in certain positive aspects inside the United States. You get negative aspects there as well. There is a bit of a tendency at the moment, again, amongst some of the same people I previously have mentioned and criticized, which is the sort of the multipolarist types. Some of them just tend to see all opposition to the current reigning parties as good. Now, there's a generalized, or there is a general spirit of revulsion in the working class in Britain against the current political establishment. That's true. From what I can tell, that exists to a certain extent inside the United States. American comrades, please feel free to correct me if you disagree or offer your own point of view. But as with anything else, like as Daniel says in his comment, without a strong organized proletarian politics, without a strong communist party to take the developing class consciousness, or the hopefully developing class consciousness of the American proletariat in a positive direction, without that level of organization, then it flips into the other direction, which is that with the crisis of legitimacy facing American imperialism in terms of its political system, no matter who wins the election, be it Biden's shuffling corpse or Trump, the immortal orange man, it is going to raise questions of legitimacy, because a large section of the American population probably won't accept the result. In fact, we already know that from Trump's win in 2016 that large elements of the American state machine didn't accept the result. So again, this is all underpinned by a growing crisis of American imperialism. And we'll get into those questions more when we get to the question of the border. So good morning to Banana Bender on the other end of the world. Jay, who says, good evening from Northern Virginia. And Cobra Commander simply says, Comrade Stalin, and salutes. And rightly so. Rianne, who says, good evening from Wales. Cobra Commander says, do you all ever play Minecraft for like 3 hours and then just die and lose everything? Never played Minecraft once, to be honest. I'm aware of it, but I missed out on that. I think perhaps I am too old to appreciate it. Maybe. Correct me if I'm on the wrong track with that one. C. Bolt, good evening to you. Neil Peckham, good evening to you. Morgan, who says, good evening, looking forward to this after a couple of pints. Well, I am always happy to entertain those who've been in the pub. So, maybe I'll break out a couple of the impressions to bring up the comedy level at some point. We may need to do a Trump impression. We may need to do a Bill Clinton impression. Maybe even I'll drop in a James Carville impersonation just to really lighten the mood. Sofiak, good evening. Jenny, good evening to you. Munis, hello. And Banana Bender liked the discussion with Don on the Revolution Report. Yes, that was a good one. I think I really appreciated getting his perspective on the questions over the birth rates in the post-Soviet states. And also, it's a consistent surprise just how much of the Soviet era did actually survive, or the legacies of the Soviet era continue to survive to this day. And I think they continue to survive principally because of the resistance of the Russian proletariat against the oligarchy. And I think I keep having to reevaluate my views of the development of the Putin era since the 2000s. It seems that the institutional opposition, shall we say, the bloc of parties in the Duma, and the strong presence of the KPRF does and has played a role in checking, shall we say, the comprador elements that were and have been previously in the Putin coalition, shall we say. And also, there's elements in that Putin coalition as well who are in favor of preserving large elements of the Soviet legacy. So I think we should draw our conclusions on the Putin era. I think we should just take our judgments from just looking at what the imperialists say and then flipping it to suit our own purposes. The imperialists wanted to destroy Russia in the 1990s, even when Yeltsin was there. And that effort only intensified as soon as Putin emerged. I think this is something that's worth coming back to in terms of the Putin legacy and how it relates to not only preservation of the Soviet legacy, but exactly where the Putin system is going under the influence of the special military operation and other developing things as well, such as now the open and incurable hostility of imperialism. There's no going back, really, to even pretending to have friendly relations with the US now, even if Trump wins and solves it all in 24 hours, as he says. Right. Ian Foster, good evening to you. Lisa says, Chairman, indeed. Everybody's enjoying the new artwork, and quite rightly so. And, right, hello to Frank. President Jesus. You're Jeff on Telegram. Okay, well, I'm responding to your comment then. Right. Lisa says the Texas situation is a massive psyop, if I've read her comment correctly. Well, we'll get to that. Gonzalo, good evening to you. Dan Kovalik, good evening to you. Glad you're enjoying the show. Edward, good evening. And Otis, who says that they love the work as well. Edward Allen says populism, I think you're referring to the United States here, with a religious element is inevitable, I think. We must orient to it correctly. I disagree with that. I would love to hear your reasons for it. Now, populism's a whole other show, so we will get to that. Sofiak says, isn't Putin himself an oligarch? Well, I've looked at this. There's a lot of claims about the wealth of Putin himself. And what I would say is that if Putin wanted to be an oligarch, he had ample opportunity to do so. I mean, he was, as I've said many times, he did start his career with a man who was very much an oligarch, which is Anatoly Sobchak. And Putin had the opportunity all the way through the 90s to steal as many assets as he could get his hands on. So he was in a position where he could do so and he could make it all legal. He was assistant to Sobchak when he was mayor of St. Petersburg, which is really called Leningrad. And he then was director of the FSB for a while. He worked in the Yeltsin administration the Yeltsin regime, I should say, when everybody was stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. So he's had plenty of opportunities back then to just take all the money, cash out, and fuck off, or just take all the money and run away and retire to a very large dacha somewhere, or build himself a horrific Russian-style McMansion. He didn't take those opportunities. Now, you'll have heard my many criticisms of Putin and his system beforehand, but I don't think Navalny's charges are right. I think you would be right to say that someone like Yanukovych bordered on being an oligarch. I mean, that fucker had more gold toilets than Donald Trump. But I don't think Putin is. As I said, he had the opportunity. I mean, he could have really cashed in after 2008, after his first 2 terms were up. Could have cut himself a nice deal with the oligarchy. Could have handed the country over to somebody who was, he did temporarily hand over to Medvedev, who was regarded as more of a pro-business type at the time, and perhaps at the time he was. He could have cashed out then. He didn't need to run again in 2012. I mean, he'd done 2 terms. So, again, if he wanted just to make money, he could have done. And could have happily either gone into retirement in Russia or cashed himself out and gone into exile in London, like a lot of the oligarchs who he used to cut deals with. So, I don't think that charge is correct. Now, is he a particularly wealthy man? I don't know. I haven't seen the finances. I've seen the Navalny documentary, and I don't think that makes particularly convincing claims, to be honest. So, I don't think he is. Whatever else you can say about the man, he hasn't made life easy for himself. Becoming president of a fractious, almost broken apart country, a country that had been almost wrecked, I should say, by the compradors in the 90s, and taking it over in 1999, end of 1999, when he first became acting president. He took on an incredibly difficult job, which could have easily ended in his own death. Given the number of very dangerous people around at the time who weren't very happy with some of the stuff that he did early on. So I think whatever else you can say about him, money isn't his motivational factor. Again, he had plenty of opportunities to walk away with huge bags of cash, and he hasn't done so. So again, I always see him basically as a sort of Russian national liberal, really. A man who is prepared to lean in various different directions at various different times in support of his overarching project, which is to rebuild the Russian state as he sees it, and rebuild it in such a way as, I think the guiding principle that he seems to have is that he wants to incorporate a myriad of different elements of Russia's past into this sort of new consensus that he wants to build. I've got a myriad of problems with that, but again, the man is driven by an idea and an ambition, not by cash grabbing. And if he was, again, he's made enemies successively of oligarchs who he was previously friends with, like Deripaska, Boris Berezovsky, the late and unlamented Boris Berezovsky, and others who he protected for a while and then had to jettison as time has gone on. So, I mean, the other thing you have to bear in mind, I mean, people credit Putin himself with the anti-Western turn. Putin's not the most anti-Western candidate out there. I mean, as he himself has said, there were others 25 years ago, who in the military and intelligence services in particular, who would have taken a much harder line much quicker. Remember, Putin had to overrule his own general staff to collaborate with the US occupation of Afghanistan, starting in 2001. There were others who would have gone much further. Now, what Putin has done is built a system which has evolved as time has gone on, but has sort of reconciled all these different competing forces in this sort of Bonapartist system. Now, the question that Cobra Commander poses is a legitimate one, which is that, well, what happens when he goes? I mean, he's going to be 75, 76 by the time he finishes his next term, because I think he's pretty obviously going to win this Russian presidential election. And that raises another question, though, which is that, okay, the Putin era has rebuilt the industrial base, stopped the collapse of the country, done certain positive things which should be acknowledged. But as the KPRF points out, the Putin system also leaves a lot of things unresolved. It leaves a lot of Western influence still there in the form of the Yeltsin wrecking of the old Soviet education system. There's still, as we were discussing last night, the issue of the birth rates to be solved, even though the Russian government's taking active measures to solve it. And in reality, what will push Russia forward is a return to a socialist system. And my hope is that through all this, that the KPRF can unite with other forces on the Russian revolutionary side of things. There are other Russian communist organizations outside the KPRF, and that what you will need to do is to, of course, rebuild a revolutionary consciousness amongst the masses. That is what will ultimately preserve Russian independence and sovereignty. It's been saved by this sort of unique coalition that Putin has built, but he is a uniquely talented manager of that system. And when it goes, of course, you do run the risk of, some different a chancer or a fool taking it over. They're going to be aided by the fact that U.S. imperialism is decaying and falling to pieces. But in the end, the way that Russia survives and the way that it thrives is by a return to socialism, by a return to the active involvement of the masses in the running of the affairs of the nation. That's the way that a country truly thrives. That's how the DPRK has survived for 30 years, post the demise of the Soviet Union. So, slight delay there, but there we go. Now, let's move on then to the ICJ ruling, which of course has everybody in the liberal space, frantically beating the drum and declaring that it's a this is it moment for them. Now, first of all, before we get into it, let's talk a little bit about bourgeois legality and what value that has. Now, of course, Lenin himself observed that the way in which we will have to proceed may involve at various different points, just turning something off there, at various different points, having to involve ourselves in bourgeois democratic processes. It may involve having to defend ourselves in bourgeois courts. It will involve having to actually use the full scope of the bourgeois legal system to defend ourselves. I mean, we've seen this recently in Britain, where comrades of mine, my party comrades, have been arrested for political offences. And so you then have to use the bourgeois legal system to actually get yourself out of it. So Lenin was always very clear that depending upon which stage the struggle is at, you shift your tactics accordingly. And it may be that you have to, again, use their legal system at certain points. Now, but we should always be clear that when you're using their legal system, basically what you're having to do is to try and contend with the enemy on his own terrain. Bourgeois law is, of course, really an expression of the interest of the ruling class. We all know this, and therefore we always must keep it in mind that while we must, of course, use the system to defend ourselves at time. We must construct or have lawyers construct for us legal arguments to defend comrades who are having to face the charges brought by the cops or having to defend themselves in some way. We must always bear in mind that what we are doing is we are entering into a battle with the enemy on unequal terms. Bourgeois law is their law. That doesn't mean, however, that we shouldn't be prepared to use it if we absolutely have to. And this is a tactical consideration that communists need to make. Now, how does that apply to the situation in Gaza? How does that apply to this ICJ judgment? Well, we're going to go through the key points as I see it in a moment, but the headline news is that, of course, that the International Court of Justice, the judges there, 15 out of 17 of them, essentially agreed with most of the points that the South African legal team made with regard to the actions of Israel constituting potential violations of the Genocide Convention. Now, I'm going to make some legalistic arguments later about Palestine and Palestinian armed resistance and Yemeni armed resistance. But first of all, the whole question here is that with regard to like the ICJ and its rulings and things like that, this is, if nothing else, it is good propaganda for those of us who are in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. We can use this to highlight just how empty the British and the American imperialists claim to support all the things that they've been banging on about for decades: human rights, international law, international conventions on X, Y, and Z, how that they stand for the so-called rules-based or international order. The crap that they come out with all the time that those of us watching this program might know as a load of old shit, but there's plenty of people out there in the world who still consider it to be a real thing. Now, we've already seen Netanyahu has responded. He's responded by basically giving the court ruling a middle finger, which is what he was always going to do. And the US has responded by saying, we don't think there's a case. The bourgeois press in Britain has mostly responded by either not reporting about the case at all or trying to cover it up or trying to caveat its death with the whole, well, Hamas, blah, 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 but Hamas, blah, blah, blah. So it's good talking points for us to use. If you're out there doing political campaigning on the issue of occupied Palestine and you're talking to people who have different levels of consciousness, being able to mention that, the International Court of Justice ruled this way and is a useful thing to be able to draw on if you're talking to somebody who still believes in those kinds of things. And you can say, look, the court found this X, Y, and Z. They found that Israel is potentially violating the Genocide Convention, and they've made various instructions to Israel to basically stop doing it. Of course, Israel's not going to. And the fact that they have made this ruling is a useful conversation starter. Now, of course, if that conversation goes well and you're talking to somebody who's a potential contact or possibly somebody who maybe wants to work with your organization or join in a political party with you or something, then you can develop the conversation further about the extreme limitations of the bourgeois legal system. But again, these are useful talking points to have at this stage. So, whereas the Israeli state and the U.S. imperialists behind them are not going to be constrained at all by this. Again, it's useful propaganda. It demonstrates how full of shit the U.S. imperialists are. It erodes any authority that they had left in the world. I'm amazed they had any after 2003, to be honest, but apparently all they needed to do was to put a black guy in charge, and that was enough to convince some of these compradors all over the world that everything had changed. But then again, a man will always believe something if his payoff depends on him believing it. So, this is a sort of lengthy document, about 30 pages long, that the ICJ issued. You can find essentially clips on YouTube of the summaries offered by the judges, and the full ICJ judgment is on their website if you want to go through it. Now, it goes at length through the various points made by the South African legal team. Now, just as a side note, I think we need to credit the campaign waged by the comrades of the economic freedom fighters, led by Julius Malema, who were the first to make a big issue in South Africa of the actions of the Israeli regime, putting a lot of pressure on Ramaphosa and the ANC to actually do something. So there's that. And also, I think that the bringing of this case has also been coordinated probably between the South Africans, the Russians, and the Chinese as well. Because it very much reminded me of the way that Putin, essentially, when he was making his speech to launch the special military operation, he essentially turned all of the US imperialists' legalistic arguments for their interventions, particularly in Kosovo and Libya. He flipped them on their head and used them against them, essentially. So we will proceed. So point 58, and that's page 19 of the ICJ's ruling, goes. They spend the first half of the document going through the claims that the South African legal team were making, and the rather limited defence that the Israelis made, which is the Israelis basically said two things: one, the court has no right to rule on this, and two, we're not doing anything wrong, piss off. Strangely enough, those weren't compelling arguments. So, point 58, it says, the court has already found that at least some of the rights asserted by South Africa under the Genocide Convention are plausible, meaning that the claims that the South African legal team were making about genocidal actions of the Israeli regime were plausible, were falling within the Genocide Convention, which is this treaty from back in the early days of the United Nations that was originally entitled the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is from 1948. Interestingly enough, when I was checking who'd signed this, the US signed it on the 11th of December 1948. The US ratified it on the 25th of November 1988. So that's a 40-year delay. Britain, by the way, only ratified this in 1970. Now, bear in mind that the British had been involved in, arguably, genocidal actions in a lot of their counterinsurgency wars in Malaysia in particular, but also they'd been involved in, at the very least, a campaign of mass murder in Kenya and some other places too. The US, of course, only signs this when we're getting towards the end of the Cold War, when Gorbachev is surrendering everything, and you've had the US engage in multiple and prolonged genocides, Indonesia being one of them. Their actions in places like Guatemala, Nicaragua, arguably would qualify as well. So that's one thing to say. Another signatory to this Genocide Prevention Convention is, of course, Yemen, which is going to come into play later on. So these are, of course, interesting points, which, again, I'll bring up later. But to go back to point 54 in the judgment, I'll read this out as well. In the court's view, the facts and circumstances mentioned above are sufficient to conclude that at least some of the rights claimed by South Africa for which it is seeking protection are plausible. This is the case with respect to the right of the Palestinians in Gaza to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts identified in Article 3 of, and the right of South Africa to seek Israel's compliance with the latter's obligations under the convention. Very lengthy legalese terminology there to basically say that Israel is indeed violating the Genocide Convention. So what does Article 3, or mention there, of the Genocide Convention actually say? So it's a rather short document. You can easily find it online. It hasn't been erased by the US PSYOP division just yet. Article 3 says the following acts shall be punishable. This is a direct quote from the Genocide Convention document. A. Genocide. B. Conspiracy to commit genocide. C. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide. D. Attempt to commit genocide. Or E. Complicity in genocide. So the court has essentially ruled that the South African claim that the Israeli regime is engaging in any of those points A, B, C, D, or E, genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, incitement to genocide, an attempt to commit genocide, or complicity in genocide. They're saying that the Israeli government is engaging in one or all of the above, basically. So we then go on to what the measures that the ICJ basically asked the Israeli government to take. So this is point 78, page 23 of the document. The court considers that with regard to the situation described above, Israel must, in accordance with its obligations under the Genocide Convention in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of this convention, in particular, point A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and B, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. The court recalls that these acts fall within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention when they are committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a group as such. The court further considers that Israel must ensure with immediate effect that its military forces do not commit any of the above described acts. And a couple of other points to read here. Point 79. The court is also of the view that Israel must take all measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. Point 80. The court further considers that Israel must take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Point 81. Israel must also take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of Articles 2 and 3 of the Genocide Convention against members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. Now, bear in mind, the court itself has no power to actually implement any of this. It has to paraphrase, or perhaps to give a quote that is attributed to Stalin, but I'm not sure if he actually said this, but I think it'd be fun if he did. He said once, well, fuck the Pope, how many divisions does he have anyway? I'm not sure whether he ever actually said that, but it's a good quote. Now, Netanyahu will essentially turn around and say, well, fuck the ICJ, how many divisions have you got? And the US will probably do the same thing, because this now goes before the Security Council, where presumably Russia and China will vote for it. I don't know what that slimy little turd Macron will do, but the US will certainly veto it. The British will probably sit on the fence and probably abstain. That's my guess. But if you actually implemented this, or if there was any way of implementing it, what it would mean essentially would be an immediate end to the war. Because the war itself, the court has almost admitted, is a war based on mass extermination of civilians and the attempted expulsion of the Palestinian population from Gaza. Now, we know that because that was an aim expressed publicly by almost the entire Israeli cabinet and the Israeli president. As the ICJ notes in their ruling, citing, of course, the vast documenting of evidence of public statements by Israeli political leaders that the South African case had put together, that their specific aim was mass expulsion. And we know that also implicated in this directly is the government of the United States. That resolves one question here, and or helps resolve one question, which is that if the US actually doesn't block this, then the US is essentially voting to indict itself, because Tony Blinken, in the first few weeks after October the 7th, spent a lot of time trying to convince the comprador in chief in Egypt, Sisi, that it was in his interests to basically open up the borders and accept the mass expulsion of the Palestinian population into the Sinai. That was what the US was trying to do initially. It was only because al-Sisi might be a comprador, he might be one of the worst scumbags out there, but he's not suicidal. If he was seen to be collaborating in that kind of maneuver, the second Nakba, which a lot of Israeli officials have been calling for, having denied they did the first one for years, he would be finished, possibly in a very physical sense. So the US can't, even if for some reason Joe Biden woke up tomorrow and decided, hey man, you know what, I'm going to vote for that genocide thing. He couldn't vote at the UN to endorse this, because he'd essentially be indicting himself. Not only were they directly implicated in trying to carry out the kind of mass expulsion of the civilian population that they put the Bosnian Serb military commanders on trial for, that they put Ratko Mladic on trial for, that they put Radovan Karadzic on trial for, and Slobodan Milosevic, even though he was found not guilty posthumously, shall we say, given that he deceased by the time the verdict came in. But they've put many people on trial for doing far less, and they've put people on trial also for being propagandists. They put the guys who were running the Hutu-aligned radio channel in Rwanda on trial. One of them was this bizarre white guy. I think he was from Italy. Don't know what the hell he was doing there. But going back even further, Nuremberg established the precedent for execution of people who incited genocide. And that was, of course, the fate that awaited a certain wretched individual by the name of Julius Streicher, who was the editor of Der Stürmer. And it was alleged, correctly, that he had played a role in orchestrating or preparing the ground for the mass murder of Jews. So given the way that these precedents have been set in the past, if you actually applied this stuff, this so-called international law, then the lead people who should be on the end of a rope are the US imperialists, the British imperialists, the French imperialists, and the German imperialists. And, of course, they will not see that justice this side of a revolution. But now, of course, we come to the discussion of, like, well, what is the use of this? Now, as I said, there is a certain amount of propaganda value in it. If you're out there campaigning on the issue of Occupy Palestine, and the other side of it is, of course, legal arguments. If you have to get into one, if you're facing questioning by the authorities, shall we say, about certain things, then you can say, well, I am actually, if by saying things like victory to the resistance or victory to the Palestinians, I'm actually fully in line with international law. Now, of course, cops don't know international law. Many of them barely even know the national laws. But this is an interesting thing to throw out there if you need to. So you can make the claim, as certain legal scholars have done, that, of course, Palestinians have a right to national resistance, to armed resistance against colonial occupation, because, of course, there have been international precedents, international legal precedents set, which you can cite. Now, again, you know, the state may not care, but again, like, this is something which you may need in the case of needing to defend yourself or some comrades from aggression by the state forces, legal aggression, shall we say. So you can claim that the Palestinians have, of course, the right to armed self-defense, and also that there are various different resolutions normally passed by the UN General Assembly, which specifically UN General Assembly Resolution 3743, which affirms the legitimacy of the struggle for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from foreign domination by all available means, including armed struggle. And that resolution was passed at the time, citing the cases of the liberation struggles in Namibia and Palestine back then. And also that there is a Geneva Convention from 1977, which classifies conflicts in which peoples are fighting against alien occupation and racist regimes as armed conflicts, and that individuals engaged in such fighting should be afforded the status of prisoners of war, meaning that their fighting is legitimate under current standards of war making. So under historical rights for self-determined rights and fights for self-determination, it's clear that under votes conducted, resolutions passed by the UN General Assembly in particular, that the Palestinians' right to armed resistance has been established in multiple cases. And so therefore you can say, again, whether the state accepts this is another matter, but you can say quite convincingly that when it comes to international law, which of course the British government says it's all in favour of, they're not, but they say they are, so use their own weapon back against them, you can then say, well, I am citing UN General Assembly votes that clearly support the right of an oppressed people fighting a foreign occupation and a racist regime to conduct their resistance by any means necessary. Again, this is a case where this is something which you may find useful to use. You don't expect the American or the British state to actually accept it. But again, it's as good a legal argument as they've got. So why not throw it at them? The other side of this is, of course, that the Yemeni blockade, you can now argue with even greater weight, you can say that what the Yemenis are doing is enacting what the US has previously called the responsibility to protect. Now, when the US declared in 1999 that the Kosovo Liberation Army, that collection of actual gangsters and drug dealers and people traffickers that hung around the borders of Kosovo, declared that they were now great heroes and liberation fighters, and that the ghastly Milosevic needed to be brought down. They, of course, imposed a blockade on what was then Yugoslavia, and they did so via threats to what was then the Yugoslav Navy, that if it put to sea it would be sunk by the US and British fleets sitting in the Adriatic. And they, of course, sealed Yugoslavia off from outside trade. And that was, so the US said at the time, all part of their stopping of what they claimed, falsely, was a genocide in Kosovo. So let's now go forward to Yemen 2023 to 2024. Yemen is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. It was signed in 1988. The current government of Yemen is clearly, and should be acknowledged as such, the government that sits in Aden, the government that is, of course, represented by the Ansar Allah movement, or is predominantly consists of the Ansar Allah movement, though there are, of course, many different factions within this, what is now a national movement. It clearly has the endorsement of the Yemeni masses, given that the overwhelming majority of the Yemeni population lives in the areas controlled by Ansar Allah. It, through its council movement, has the direct participation of the masses to a certain extent in the government of the country. It is able to mobilize millions upon millions of the masses in terms of these vast demonstrations in favor of Palestine and Palestinian solidarity. So its act, when it comes to the naval blockade of the Red Sea against the ships of the Israeli regime and now the the US and British terrorist regimes, as recognized by the Yemeni parliament, it is acting to enforce the decisions of the International Court of Justice and to abide by the Yemeni government of 1988 signature to the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. So it's clear that the actual government of Yemen is the government as represented principally by the Ansar Allah movement, and that they, as the legitimate government of Yemen and with the full endorsement of the Yemeni people, are acting to maintain an economic blockade on Israel in order to pressure the Israeli regime to stop its genocidal actions, in the same way that the US imperialists carried out a naval, air and land blockade of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia when they claimed to be preventing a genocide in Kosovo. These are all arguments you can make. And there are arguments with as much legal validity as anything that the state wants to pull out of its arse. So why not make them if you have to? So where this goes from now, it will be vetoed at the UN Security Council level. The US will be completely isolated in doing so. I think even the British will just abstain. Unless the US doesn't want to look like it's completely alone, they may tell the British that they've got to stick their hands up too. But you only need one veto at the UN Security Council, and that's what I imagine that the US imperialists will do. It'll then go to the UN General Assembly, where the vote will go overwhelmingly against the US and the Israeli regime. Again, it's not going to stop US backing for Israel, though, of course. But it's good propaganda in a way, and it also serves to demonstrate in the minds of billions of people across the world just how much bullshit that the US imperialists talk about legality and human rights and everything else. So again, it's useful, but the liberals are all, celebrating and thinking that this is some sort of moment of truth that's going to stop the Israelis in their tracks. It's not going to. The only thing that will truly stop the Israelis and the US imperialists in the region is, of course, the resistance of what's known now as the Axis of Resistance. And the Axis has its foundations now in Gaza, but of course consists of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Syrian government and the Syrian armed resistance to imperialism there, the Iraqi popular mobilization units, Ansar Allah, and the National Liberation Movement in Yemen. Of course, the Iranians are in there as well. And that's what will ultimately guarantee, as Hassan Nasrallah has said, the departure of the US imperialists from the region, which of course will follow the ending of the Israeli regime. Now, the other point, and this is a related one, that I wanted to reach tonight with regard to the question of Israel and the question of US support for Israel. Now, this is the piece that I was asked to comment on with regard to US support for Israel. It's the piece on Yasha Levine's Substack. Now, I find Levine to be a rather mixed figure. I frequently and vehemently disagree with him on a number of things, but he has done some very interesting writing. His writings on the Soviet Jewish experience and how the Zionists manipulated the Soviet Jewish population into securing a wave of migration out of the Soviet Union to Israel from the late 60s onwards. So I think Levine's done some very interesting work on that and some very valuable work. His opinions on modern Russia, I know he's from Russia originally, I do disagree with. I think that his view of the Putin system is outdated. I think he's still judging it like it's basically like a more evolved version of the Yeltsin system, and I don't think that that's correct. However, what his argument in this particular piece, I think, is correct. And ultimately, his argument concludes, having gone through a lot of details about the campaign waged by the CIA with the assistance of Mossad to encourage Jewish migration out of the USSR. And he makes the good point that this began just after the victory of Israel in the Six-Day War. In reality, it was a 5-day war, as Norman Finkelstein says. But they called it 6 days to give it more of a biblical ring. And that, of course, comes at a time when you've had like 10 years of degeneration of the Soviet Party. And you've had grow up within this certain reactionary trends that, had the party been following a proper line, would have been nipped in the bud a lot earlier. And so by the time you get to 67, it's no surprise that you've got Zionist tendencies in the party. And a lot of the people who initially campaigns to be able to leave the Soviet Union under the influence of this CIA and Mossad operation, they were people who were actually in decent positions. They weren't ordinary workers. They were people in the nomenclatura, in the so-called intelligentsia, in highly paid positions in academia. So these weren't like, coal miners asking to leave. These were party hierarchy. These were people who lived quite well-rewarded lives. I remember going to an exhibition about this years ago when I was in Amsterdam for some strange reason. And there was a photographic exhibition sort of celebrating the Israelis, the Soviet Jews escaped from the horrible tyranny of the Soviet regime. And I started looking around at like where these people came from, and they didn't come from like fucking ghettos. A lot of them were like university lecturers. It's a funny one. The defectors from the Soviet Union, they were all, most of the time, they were people from the party hierarchy or the state hierarchy who'd actually done very well, but who basically degenerated along with that, ideologically speaking, to the point where they had become completely divorced from the masses and considered themselves special, and either they wanted to get more money for themselves, or they'd run into trouble by engaging in open treachery, engaging in too much corruption, and therefore they defected to the West and were acclaimed heroes. That lying bullshit artist Dostoevsky, sorry. A curse on me for defaming the great man. Solzhenitsyn being the absolute fucking worst of those. But the conclusion that Levine makes in his piece, which is he's talking about how the Israel lobby, and he echoes an argument by Chomsky, which is one of Chomsky's arguments that that I wholly do agree with, is that the Israel lobby is wildly overstated in terms of its powers by people like Mearsheimer and others, the other so-called realists, realist critics of the U.S. alignment with Israel. And its power is overstated by these so-called realists because they don't want to confront the reality of U.S. imperialism. And the reality of U.S. imperialism and the alliance with Israel is that U.S. imperialism takes this alliance over from the British after 1956, really. It's when the U.S. starts managing this after the British attempt at an independent armed intervention gets kiboshed by Eisenhower, who just lifted his finger and told the New York traders to do a run on the pound, and that brought the British to heel pretty quickly. So the U.S. imperialists start to slowly take over this relationship with the Israeli colonial state, started by the British after 56. And they do so for the same reasons the British started it. The British start the Zionist enterprise in Mandate Palestine for the specific purpose of making sure, as I've said many times before, and this is all taken from quotes in British colonial officials' records, that the newly independent Arab states, following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, would never be able to unite. And you needed to keep them divided in order to principally make sure that the vast natural resources that were being discovered through the 20s and into the 30s would remain under the control of the British, and then later under the control of the Anglo-Americans. Now, you do that by, you have your comprador regimes in Saudi Arabia, what later was the UAE, Qatar, Oman, places like that. But you need another element in there. And that element, as I've explained before, being the armed camp of imperialism, the Israeli regime. Its job is to, of course, make sure that the Arab nations remain weak and divided by its very nature means, of course, that it has to be aggressive, it has to be expansionist, it has to be constantly committing crimes. This is the very nature of the Zionist ideology. It's supremacism, ethno-supremacism, religious supremacism. And the aim of putting such an entity in the middle of, well, what's properly called now West Asia, is that it will create an enormous amount of trouble for all of the states around it. And this will, the original aim of the British was that this would justify a continued British presence in the region. This was the original British plan that the great communist leader from Scotland, Willie Gallagher, wrote about in articles in the late 1930s. The idea was the Zionist state would create would play very merry hell in the region. It would be constantly clashing with the state of Palestine that the British planned to establish, and the British would put themselves in the middle as neutral arbiters. This has evolved over the years, but the same process applies. The Israeli state creates all kinds of chaos. The US then, back in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, would step in and say, we're the arbiters, we're going to engage in a peace process, our presence in the region is absolutely essential. You see, imperialists never just pursue one way of ruling. You have the US bases in the region. That's one way of securing domination over the natural resources. You have the comprador regimes, but of course they're looking a little bit shaky these days, especially the Saudis. Then you have other ways of ensuring that your presence in the region is guaranteed. You have to have multiple levels of control. So the direct military direct military occupation, military bases, comprador regimes, those are a couple of ways of doing this. The other way is, of course, ensuring you have a permanent political presence by claiming that you're the only one who can possibly restrain this mad dog, this mad Zionist dog in Tel Aviv, which is attacking everybody and causing all kinds of problems. And you claim then that you're the one who will guarantee that the peace process will be engaged with. Yeah, this is the trap that, of course, that Sadat jumped into with the Camp David Accords. This is the trap that the PLO went into in the Oslo process, whereby they surrendered on everything and got nothing. And this is the game that the US has been playing. You deploy the dog, which only you've got the silent whistle to call back. Then you will say, well, okay, I'll restrain it from attacking you if you concede on X, Y, and Z. And then PLO concede on X, Y, and Z, destroy their own legitimacy in the process, become a corrupt tool of imperialism and rejected by the masses. And then the Americans say, look, you see, these people were never serious about peace in the first place. Look, they've just elected Hamas. So you see how these different levels of imperialist domination work. You have the economic level, you have the military control level, you have the political control level via the compradors, and you also have another political level, which is you claiming you're the only one who can restrain the mad dog. And that's the way in which the US imperialists conduct themselves via Israel. This is Israel's utility. And you now get the question asked by the so-called realists and others of, well, why is the US continuing to damage itself before the eyes of the world in continuing to back the Israeli madman? And again, this comes down to the fact that the realists aren't very realistic, which is that they don't understand the nature of imperialism. On some level, these, particularly the American realists, want to believe that the US state isn't somehow imperialist, that it's just it's not intrinsically imperialist, that it's just a bunch of bad decisions, that it's a clique of neocons who've ruined the great American Republic. This is all myth-making. This is all nonsense. The American state now is as fundamentally imperialist. It is soaked in imperialism due to the nature of the development of American capitalism to the level of imperialism. It is a wholly imperialist enterprise now. And the idea that this can somehow be chalked up to a bunch of, bad actors who are, neocons, or it's the Israel lobby. It's always, for these guys, it's always some bad actors or bad ideas who've corrupted and corroded the wonderful American Republic. Sad thing is, guys, that your wonderful republic is an imperialist entity, just as our beloved kingdom is. And the alliance with Israel serves their purposes still to this day. If Israel goes down, if the Netanyahu regime collapses, and this is, by the way, the reason why they're stuck with Netanyahu, they would love, the US imperialists, particularly the Biden end of things, the Democrats, would love to have literally anybody else in there who could put a better face on this. Somebody less corrupt, somebody who's not in bed with the ultra religious right, with the open fascist elements in Israel. They would love to put them people back in a box again, have them just committing massacres quietly behind closed doors. They would love to have some sort of liberal figure who they could elevate and put on a pedestal and say, look, this is Israel. But they don't have that, because the nature of Israel has degenerated to the point where Netanyahu is one of the more, he's the only figure who can knit together all these ultra-reactionary trends to sort of put in place some kind of stable government. But again, and they won't abandon him openly, because if the Netanyahu regime collapses, if the US turns around and goes, all right, Benjamin, no more weapons, no more money, no more nothing, pack it all up and begin talks with the Palestinians tomorrow, then not only is Netanyahu finished, there is going to be a possible civil war erupt in Israel itself. The Israeli state is incredibly unstable. It has been for quite a long time now. And so if Biden did what his realist critics say that he should do, if he did do this, it would be the end of Israel. And that would be the precursor, as people like Hassan Nasrallah very well understand, I think the Iranian leaders understand it as well. If Israel goes down, then you can kiss goodbye to British and American influence in West Asia completely. It will be gone. The Saudi regime has already spread its bets into the BRICS alignment. The UAE is playing both sides, as they always do. They've got their deals with the Chinese and the Russians as well. And the Qataris and others and the Omanis are also looking to spread their bets a little bit. The one who's still devoted to the cause is the King of Jordan. And he might pay a price for that, who knows? Or even he might get tempted to, again, spread his bets. So if Israel goes down, the influence of the US imperialists will go with it. If they go down in Israel, they'll be out of Saudi Arabia before too long. It won't be too long before some tendencies, even in the hierarchy of the Saudi royal family, start to bring back the demands of old Osama himself, that the US should get out of their holy places. The British will certainly be finished. No one will take them particularly seriously, particularly when they're facing defeat in Ukraine. The continued existence of Israel is fundamental to the presence and the influence of, and the continued domination exercised by, US imperialism in West Asia. I got to reiterate the point. If Israel goes down, that's the US influence in West Asia fatally compromised. It will be gone in a few short years if Israel disappears. Again, the Axis of Resistance leaders understand this very well. I wish more people who are supposedly critics of the US understood it too. But until these so-called realists come face to face with the fact of America as an imperialist power, And to do that, they'd have to come face to face with and reckon with the correctness of Lenin's analysis, and not many of these people are willing to do that. But that's the point, and this is the reason why I agree with Levine's conclusion. Eventually, the crisis will get to the point where the US imperialists will be faced with a choice. Either try and preserve what you have in the region, which will be a difficult task, or continue to fanatically defend the Israeli military outpost to the bitter end. And if they do choose the latter, then they'll be finished in West Asia even quicker than if they try and negotiate. So in the end, I think Yasser Levine's point is correct. The US imperialists will attempt a negotiation in the end. We might be a way away from it yet, but it is coming. And ultimately, the Israel lobby that does exist, it is a real thing. It can move a lot of money. Look at the way it bought itself a presidential candidate in the form of the wretched Kennedy, who, by the way, is just as shit as his father and his uncle. Bunch of anti-communist swines, all of them. But it purchased a presidential candidate this time round. It easily bought the loyalty of Donald Trump, a man who openly will say that his allegiances are, shall we say, fluid, depending upon where the money's going. But in the end, their influence is and will be nothing next to the continued survival of the influence of US imperialism in the region if the choice finally does arrive, which it will. And so, yes, I agree with Levine's point. I think it's one of his better articles, and I think it's something which should be kept in mind. I think the influence of the so-called realists, it needs to be critiqued properly, which I will come to doing maybe in a couple of weeks' time. And their view of the actions of the US imperialists, or they would call it US foreign policy, is skewed by their inability to understand the US as an imperialist power. Right. So now we get to, and I will be going back to your questions and comments in the chat, so hang on for that one. But the final point I wanted to make tonight, which is about the Texas border question, militant statements put out by Governor Abbott of Texas, and he's done an interview with Tucker Carlson, apparently, where he sort of banged the table and said all kinds of wild things. And Biden's saying all kinds, or whoever's writing Biden's statements is saying all kinds of wild things. We will defy the court order. I appeal to the Abbotts and Trump are appealing to the other governors to send representatives or elements of their National Guard units down to reinforce the border. Look, it's a big election year manipulation is what is going on. Now, there's a lot of fevered talk about Civil War II in the United States, but let's keep something in mind here. The original Civil War, back in 1861, was a clash between two sections of the American ruling class. The side represented by the Union, which were the northern manufacturers, the representatives of the industrial capitalist mode of production. And then you had the outdated elements in the South, who were a class representing a lower and more primitive mode of production. And whereas the two had uneasily sat alongside each other for 70-odd years after independence, it was no longer possible to have them go together anymore. The northern manufacturers wanted the slave system either negotiated away or gone. The South completely refused to back down, completely refused to negotiate. By the way, if you want more on this, revisit the interviews that I did with Comrade Marius on the channel. Very interesting discussion on that. So you had there a clash between two different elements in the US ruling class, one which represented the future of the development of capitalism in the United States, one which represented the past, and one needed to overcome the other to fully develop the country. So this is why I don't take seriously, at this stage, the talk of civil war in the United States. I don't think the divisions within the American capitalist class are anything like as big as they were in 1860-61 when the American Civil War started. I don't think that the US is at that stage right now, where there are, of course, divisions between the higher end of the US imperialists, those who make their money out of the US imperial system, and the lower end of the US bourgeois, which is the national capitalists, or in some cases the more state-based capitalists, the people who are more likely to be backers of Trump, together with like certain elements of the state and regional petty bourgeoisie. So those divisions do exist. I don't think that we're at the stage where it's going to break out into some sort of civil war as yet. Now, bear in mind that we are in a period of imperial decline. If the US goes into a steep decline and the motivations for some of these regional, state-based bourgeois actors increase for possible separatism. I mean, one commenter in the Telegram group today, I forget who it exactly was. If you're here in the chat, do feel free to put your hand up. Made a decent analysis of this and said that there is a possibility that elements in the Texas capitalist class might be looking at the possible loss of access to Middle Eastern oil and thinking, well, we might get a better deal for ourselves as striking out as an independent Texas at some point in the future. I mean, again, like I've never been to Texas. I last set foot in the United States in 1997. So my view on this is, of course, based wholly through the internet. But there are some bourgeois types who sort of flirt with secessionism. But bear in mind, I think any talk of like some sort of potential fracturing in the United States is a long way in the future, unless there's a really dramatic decline in the US empire overseas, in which case we may have to revisit the question. I just don't see it at the moment. I mean, also bear in mind it's an election year, and there are a lot of offices up for election in Texas, including, of course, one US Senate office, which of course is occupied by the slimy fuzzball himself, Ted Cruz. You've also got all 38 congressional representatives from Texas up for election. You've got like state senators, all the 150 representatives of the state House of Representatives are up for election. It's a big year in Texas, election-wise. So Abbott is upping the ante and like doing some electioneering, essentially. Now, there are some who will say, well, what if this gets out of hand? And it is a possibility. Some bourgeois politician decides to, blow the horn and flirt with the idea of secessionism and clashes with the hated federal government. Maybe things get out of hand, but I don't see it. At the moment, this suits both the Republican side and the Democrat side. The Democrats, via Biden, get to fire up their base, which they need to, considering that they've been damaged by their associations with the genocide and the murder spree of the Israeli regime. Biden needs some good press. So, what better way to bolster his fictional anti-racist credentials than having a staged confrontation with the evil old, the spirit of the Confederacy as represented by Greg Abbott and Donald Trump. What better way to get the donations pouring in, fire up your base, maybe bring some of those recalcitrant youth voters back around again by conjuring up the idea of Biden as the great defender of the oppressed minorities, and that he's prepared to intervene and use the power of the federal government to assert control over these despicable, diabolical racists in Texas. You know how it's going to go. And Abbott, on the other side of things, is playing it in the same way, but in a different direction. I'm standing up against the Soros-inspired, great replacement invasion orchestrated by Joe Biden. We will not be replaced. We are the Alamo, etc. You should probably remember that the Alamo lost. Maybe old Greg cuts off the John Wayne version of the Alamo before the end. Again, this suits both halves of the U.S. bourgeois political system are perfectly happy with the way that this is going at the moment. Now, that's not to say that this won't degenerate further in the future if U.S. imperialism plunges into a deeper crisis, but at the moment, I'd say don't fall for this. This is, I mean, a lot of people are jumping all over it and screaming and jumping up and down about, it's Civil War II. No, this is election season staged events. And everybody involved in this, the political actors, are very happy with the way it's going because it's firing up enthusiasm amongst their voting bases. It's probably getting a lot of donations going into Greg Abbott's battle funds. Again, it's probably motivating people back into, at least Biden hopes so, into potentially voting for him again. It's a big show. And ultimately, it'll be concluded with some kind of fudged element along with a broader deal on the border, which will probably mean more border militarization. So the other comment I wanted to make is that on this particular question, look, border militarization in the United States is a big manipulation going back at least 30 years, probably longer, but certainly 30 years post-Cold War. Clinton, of course, Bill Clinton was big on border militarization. And what is the purpose of border militarization? Because both sides of the bourgeois political system in the United States have been into it in various different forms. Like Donald Trump's not really saying that much that wasn't said about border security by Bill Clinton back in the mid-90s. Like Trump's no more extreme than Clinton or even Obama. Bear in mind, Obama's officialdom stayed on and served under Trump. A lot of the people that his administration appointed to U.S. Border Patrol and ICE, the hated ICE that AOC did so much fake crying over, they all stayed on and served under Trump. So who's the bad guy? Well, the answer is all of them. Now, border militarization came in, it significantly escalated in the early 90s. At the same time, of course, Clinton was pushing through NAFTA, which not only, of course, led to deindustrialization of large parts of the United States, it also led to decimation for small and medium-sized farmers in Mexico and a giant wave of migration into the United States, which, of course, suited the U.S. capitalist class absolutely fine. Just as, by the way, this wave of migration, which is being subject to such political manipulation right now, this suits the U.S. capitalism just fine, because they're going to need all the tools at their disposal to carry out attacks upon the wages, terms and conditions of the U.S. working class. And that means you need a much higher labor pool to draw from. But at the same time, you can't have that labor pool unionizing. You certainly don't want it engaging in joint actions with the pre-existing working class population. You've got to sow as many divisions as possible between the different layers of the working class. And so this comes in very handy, as does militarization, as does the role of ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement as they're known. The ICE raids are into in particular areas. Some of those are as a direct response to calls put in by the employers who have got a lot of supposedly illegal laborers on their payroll. And if they have any trouble with them, well, they just stick in a call to ICE and have them shipped out again. It's a great way of ensuring that you have a big pool of very low-waged, hyper-exploitable labor in the United States, which can be deported at any time with a quick call to ICE. So border militarization isn't about keeping people out. It's about letting them in, but then having a regime of terror that you can impose upon them when they do get in, to keep them malleable, to keep them in a state of fear, so that they don't do anything awkward like unionize, and that you've inspired so much division with the pre-existing working class that you stop unity of the working class in other ways, through either unionization or joining joint campaigns together. So this is a manipulation. The whole debate around the US-Mexico border in the bourgeois press, in bourgeois politics, is a manipulation. And the best advice I can offer and much like our own experience with the whole stupid stop the boats bullshit that we've got here, is don't fall for it. Like, if the US ruling class was not looking to profit from the labor of all these people who are coming from areas that imperialism has despoiled, both in the Central and Southern American states and elsewhere in the world, if they really wanted to actually stop this, they have the tools at their disposal to do so. But they don't, because the reason why these waves of people keep coming is because they know there is a pre-existing demand for their labor in the United States, just as there is in Britain, just as there is in France, Italy, Germany, Spain, all the other imperialist countries. It's why Giorgia Meloni in Italy hasn't actually instituted the restrictions on immigration that she ran on, as, by the way, somebody who's an out and proud neo-fascist. Why? Because the Italian ruling class turned around and says, Georgia, quick note, we loved the whole, anti-immigration thing when you were running, but now we really need the labor of those guys coming over on the inflatable rafts from Africa, because we don't really want to pay Italian workers' wages. It's a manipulation. It's a manipulation on the left with the whole immigrants welcome here shtick, the performative stances on human rights, etc., the performative crying and theatrics by the likes of AOC. That's all for the benefit of securing the capitalist class some hyper-exploitable labor. It's performative on the right, who want you to believe that they are seriously interested in the welfare of the American working class. They are not. They just want to use the resentments and the anger, sometimes justifiable anger, that American workers have at their deteriorating living conditions, and push that in the direction of hating what will be another section soon of the American working class, because Greg Abbott and people like him know damn well that how much profit is made from the labor of people who've just come over the border. It's a performative dance, just like everything else in bourgeois politics that is served up as a spectacle. It is not meant to be resolved. It is merely meant to cause divisions and to enable the ruling class to put in more and more divisions between the different layers of the working class. Because they know very well that if all the sections of the American working class united together, then their rule wouldn't last 5 minutes. Don't fall for manipulations, basically, is the message I'm going to conclude on here. So we got a lot of contributions in the chat. Where are we now? Right, I'm going to try and trawl through these. Okay. This is from Cobra Commander. What is always on my mind is that the State Department under Trump declared the occupation over and moved the capital to Jerusalem. So technically, to US and Israeli law, anyone who resists is considered enemy of the state, which gives Israel the ability to use any method they want. Yeah, probably they could certainly put it that way, but bear in mind that Biden then changed the policy back again. I mean, he didn't move didn't remove the recognition of the embassy, but they formally committed to a two-state solution again, which again creates a problem for them because they're never going to actually do it. So, like the manipulations over bourgeois law can go on all day. So, like, we can continue to argue this out. The point is that if people want to get involved in an argument about legalities or otherwise, especially the point about legalities of resistance, we now have the international law to cite if we ever need to make those arguments. Again, use them if you need to. Always be aware of the limitations. That's what I'll say. Right. Just sip the tea again. So, Isidore says, British genocide, also South Africa. They killed 10% of the Boers in the concentration camps. No numbers for the black population, but we can assume it was similar. I think for the black population, it was probably even higher. But certainly, we should always remember that the concentration camp is a British invention, and that is one point that the Nazis always used to make. That the concentration camps were directly inspired by the British actions inside South Africa. So let's carry on. And Jenny says that the ICJ demanded a ceasefire in a roundabout way. Yes, the most roundabout way possible. Well, most of the native population of the Cape was, there was a lot of massacres carried out by the Boers and the British, but they were never able to go as far as they did in other areas, thankfully. Lisa says it's infuriating to know that the ICJ has absolutely no authority. Well, yes, that's true. It had no authority to stop the US trying to destroy Nicaragua back in the 80s, and time has not improved it. So, Cobra Commander says, I mean, we all know what's really going on. We used to have world wars over less atrocities, but who's going to start that with America? Well, arguably the resistance axis has actually started it. And they are slowly overextending US imperialism to the point where its presence in the region could become untenable. So, again, the speeches of Nasrallah have all this spelt out quite clearly. So, Cobra Commander again, it's like our social order on a geopolitical scale. The imperialists have gone all the way to end, and everyone else is still trying to conceptualize that we are past the era of debates. Well, I think plenty of people in the colonized world have got past debates a long time ago. I think a lot of people in the imperialist countries still think we're in the era of the social democratic era, basically. A rude awakening awaits. Ian Foster says, Western imperialist countries, including Britain, Germany, France, and the US, should be charged at the ICJ with complicity in genocide. Yeah, they should be, but they won't be. Sergei Prol says, Abast le capitalisme. Indeed. And evidently my ability to read the Cyrillic alphabet is coming on slightly. Right. By any means necessary. Yes, indeed. Cobra Commander. Edward says, mass rejection of state media in the West shows some ability to move ideologically. Well, I think that the working class always knows more than the bourgeoisie suspects. And the working class isn't stupid, contrary to what the bourgeois press tries to impress upon us. Because what they always try to tell us, they always try to tell you that, oh, you're stupid, you can't possibly understand all of this, or that they try to inculcate in the petty bourgeoisie that the working class is just this dumb mass. But the working class understands very well that they're getting stiffed. They understand that the system isn't working for them and hasn't done for a very long time, if ever. And that they are being lied to constantly by BBC, ITV, Channel 4, The Guardian, The Sun, The Times. That's why all of these organizations are losing their influence. It's not just because of competition from internet sources. It's that they're just not believed anymore. There are, for millions of people in the United States and Britain and elsewhere, the vision of the world that these bourgeois press outlets put out there and try and convince people that it does exist just is not believed. Now, of course, you were at the stage where the proletarian ideology is very weak, class consciousness is only just starting to recover, and so workers fall into sometimes like wild conspiracist interpretations, etc. But the instinct that there is a hidden group that makes all the decisions and that the politicians on TV are just a bunch of puppets, well, that's a solid instinct. It might not be expressed perfectly all the time, but a lot of people have solid instincts that they're being bullshitted. And that's what the ruling class can't understand. Okay, where are we now? Cobra Commander, who's very busy in the chat tonight. Always good to see it. Entertaining in America must now make millions of dollars or even $500 million to make profit. We can thank Marvel Disney for helping that along. Yeah, Marvel Disney has been great for absolutely murdering the credibility of Hollywood products. They have single-handedly destroyed the credibility of Hollywood movies, which I think is a great service they've engaged in there. Okay. So, right, Isidore says, if there's time for questions, do you have faith in the Chinese socialist leadership to play the correct strategic game with BRICS-aligned compradors in service of international communism? Wow, that's a big one. Chinese foreign relations are a constantly evolving thing. Like, Chinese foreign policy has come quite some distance. I mean, it went through some abysmal turns. From making some of the very correct judgments with regard to the USSR under Khrushchev in the early 60s, to taking a completely stupid ultra-left turn, an enormous mistake in declaring that the USSR was now social fascist or social imperialist, and declaring that they were a worse enemy of the Chinese Revolution than the US imperialists were. That was all under Mao, by the way. That was a terrible series of errors that arose out of the dispute with the USSR and the Cultural Revolution. That then, as a great man once said, the ultra-leftist deviation is ultimately a rightist one, which ultimately it turned into a rightist deviation in the post-Mao era, which they come to openly align themselves with US imperialism and ultimately end up siding with US imperialism in Namibia and Angola, and of course in Afghanistan, which is an abysmal period in Chinese foreign policy, and a completely counter-revolutionary role that they ended up playing. Now, it must be said that this was during the time when there were, in the hierarchy of the Chinese, in the Communist Party of China, people like Zhao Ziang and others who were like Gorbachev types, liquidationists. So their influence needs to be kept in mind. And they were thankfully removed and expelled and or imprisoned after the Tiananmen incident in '89. But you get for a long period, of course, the attempts of the Chinese leaders to maintain their ability to continue their relationship with the US. And that's evolved over time as the US became more and more openly hostile. So the ability of the Chinese government continued to evolve its policy. Now it's reached the point where it is almost, but not quite, prepared to go back to the language of Mao in the 50s, which I think will be justified, but it's still talking in the language of multilateralism, international law, that kind of thing. But there has been an evolution. Now, in terms of whether I trust the Chinese leadership or not, I mean, I'd need to spend much more time than I have available tonight to fully answer your question, so it's probably something I should return to, but I'll briefly say this. What's clear is that the internal life of the Chinese party is very much one that is it's a very much a party that's got a number of tendencies in it. These tendencies are clearly engaged in multiple political battles at various different times for influence over the party line, and that the revolutionary wing has actually been strengthening its position now for a number of years. Now, I'm not saying that the CPC is going to launch the next Comintern tomorrow or anything, but their position has been improving now for quite some time. The Xi era has also seen the purging of a number of the worst corrupt and comprador elements that had grown up in the Yang Zemin and Hu Jintao period. So there's improvements there. Now, I would say also that the way to look at it would be that the compradors in BRICS a lot of their fate isn't just dependent upon what the line of the Chinese is. Their fate is dependent upon what the domestic situation is in all of these countries. So again, with the decline and fall of the US empire, which is an evolving event, then a lot of these comprador regimes are going to try and evolve in a different direction, but also that's going to destabilize them. And the things that have propped them up for years, the institutions that they've dominated, the way in which they've ruled will change, and therefore the deep freeze that the various struggles in their societies have undergone for years will also start to thaw, which means that more contradictions will emerge in places like Saudi Arabia. The UAE, a bit of a different case considering how much of its workforce is externally imported, but the contradictions there will come back again. So what really we're seeing, and what we will see in this next period, is that all these countries that are moving away from the US imperialist system and the decline and the fall of the US imperialist system will open up new avenues of class struggle. So really it is the working class and the peasantry in places where there is one, let's just say the masses, if we're going to shorthand this, the masses in all these countries will decide the fate of these countries. Yes, the particular lines taken by the leading communist party in the world is going to have an influence, but it's not going to overrule the will of the masses. And if this new era opens up more space for national liberation struggles and class struggles, then this is the reason why we welcome it, not because we think that BRICS is the be-all and end-all. I hope that answers some of your question anyway. I can return to it in more depth in the future. Right. Jenny, with reference to the Zionist comment, says Aaron Matei's grandparents on his dad's side got swept up into that psyop. Ah, right, okay. Slava comments that from amazing quality of life in the USSR to the American ghetto, I can't imagine the level of their disappointment. Yeah, well, I think for a lot of them who came in the 80s and early 90s, I mean, God knows what the view... I mean, it always strikes me that, like, people from the USSR and Eastern Europe, especially of, like, the sort of what you call the Generation X lot, people born in, like, the 60s and the 70s, seemed to have those who emigrated had an incredibly naive view of what the West was. The younger generation seems to as well, but perhaps the decay and fall of the imperialist powers is educating them as to the reality. Cobra Commander says, ain't nobody going to play my boy Kim Jong-un like they did Saddam and Gaddafi. Exactly right. But also bear in mind that the DPRK system is much stronger than the Gaddafi or the Ba'athist system in Iraq, because it's based fundamentally on the rule of the masses. The masses are the rulers of the DPRK state. It's not a Saddam-like figure or a Gaddafi-like figure. That it is the fact that the DPRK has succeeded in maintaining itself as a workers' state, and to do that it has to constantly involve the masses directly in the governing of the country, and constantly be able to mobilize them in the defense of the country, and be able to draw upon their creativity for the building of and the execution of economic and technical plans. This is the reason why the DPRK has survived the ruinous, often ruinous attentions of US imperialism when Iraq, Yugoslavia under Milosevic, Libya were all destroyed. And Syria really only survived because of Russian intervention, truth be told, and Iranian intervention, of course, and the role played by Hezbollah. But it was the Russian intervention that really turned the tide on that one. Whereas for all that the US would have loved to have stormed into the DPRK, it never had the nerve to do so, because there you have a unified people who know that they are the masters of the state. They know that they are the rulers of the state, and they are prepared to fight and defend it with armed force in a way that was just not the case when it came to Ba'athist Iraq or Libya under Gaddafi, or the the decaying Titoist system in Yugoslavia. None of these places had the masses mobilized as the rulers of the state in the way that you have in the DPRK. Had they done so, had they not been flawed versions of Arab nationalism or, the decaying ruins of Titoism, then the US would have been biting off far more than it could chew by attacking any of them. Excuse me. Right. Okay. Movie Maker Joe says, coming in late but grateful to come in nonetheless. Great to see Mr. Stalin on the cover of tonight's Thoughts and Explanations. Yes, very good portrait of Stalin that was chosen for the cover of tonight's program. Tony says, war with Hezbollah looms large as Israel is left without a win and they are determined to bring the settlers back north. Look, if they go into a war with Hezbollah, then that's the end. There's no other way to describe it other than the end. And the American military know it as well. So there you go. Right, what have we got? Lisa says it's unlikely Biden gets any minority votes this time. Very true. Right. Roddy says, interesting to see the BBC fairly quickly focusing on no ceasefire, obviously not from the point of view of disagreeing with the decision, but implying that the Israelis have a right to continue the slaughter. Well, what do you expect from state broadcasting? It's always the same. Right. Isidore, excellent answer, thank you. I agree there are enormous opportunities on the horizon, but that BRICS itself is nothing but a door opener. Good point. Hello to Comrade Marius, who's joined us. Right, we've been going for nearly 2 hours now, so I'm going to draw this one to a close for this evening. We are past the midnight hour here in perfidious Albion. Thank you to everybody who's joined us on the program tonight. A lot of really good contributions in the chat. So, tune in tomorrow for the stream on Patreon on the question of sovereignty, etc. And I'll be back with you again for another stream tomorrow evening. Regular business will be resumed. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel. But until next time, thank you and...
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. Oh,